la première des choses, et les Marocains. Ensuite, forcément, on est africain aussi, et c'est la priorité, comme le Sénégal, comme le Ghana, comme le Cameroun et la Tunisie. On espère montrer que le football africain a passé une étape.
Why is it that whenever we think about Africa, we will name countries like Nigeria, Congo, Ghana, and maybe even South Africa? But we hardly if ever think about the Northern African countries. Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya. They seem to have just all been forgotten, as if they're not actually part of Africa. But for some reason, whenever we tend to think of Africa, whenever we tend to conceptualize of Africa, North Africa is always missing. It's like MIA. Where is Waldo? So tell me, why? Much of our thinking, much of our modern day thinking of North Africa for some reason not truly belonging as part of Africa goes back to the European Enlightenment era. It goes back to a German philosopher named G.W.F. Hegel. Hegel was a German philosopher from 1770 all the way to 1831, and he's one of the critical philosophers of Europe's Enlightenment age. And he's also one of the founding fathers of Western philosophy, modern day Western philosophy to be more precise. So in order to understand why North Africa and Africa, they are seen in rigid, fixed manners, in order to understand why North Africa is not seen as part of Africa, why Africa is always seen as being primitive and backwards, in order to understand why the West looks at people in a certain way, we are going to have to go all the way back in the day of them. We are going to have to go all the way back to the founding fathers in order to understand why we have this problem that we have today.
The Negro is an example of an animal man in all his savagery and lawlessness, and if he must be understood, all European attitudes must be put aside.
Hegel divided Africa into three parts. The first part he called as proper Africa. Proper Africa was how he defined as being Africa that is below the Sahara, what we call today sub-Saharan Africa. Africa that is primitive, backwards, barbarians. These people, he basically characterizes them as having no reason, no intellect, as being savage, as being barbarians, and all of that. He looks at them basically as how many of the racist cartoons depict Africans, going ooh, ooh, and doing like very primitive things and having no technology or having no sense of reason or anything like that. Then comes to North Africa. The Sahara part of Africa, especially from Morocco to Egypt, Hegel considered this part as European Africa, or at best, the other thinkers in his era considered this part as having to do with Asia, West Asia, but not truly as being part of Africa. Many European thinkers saw North Africa as being half civilized, while the rest of Africa they saw as being mainly barbarian and as being savage, being primitive, except for South Africa. South Africa, many European thinkers, especially of the Enlightenment era, the colonial era, looked at South Africa as being part of the civilized world, above North Africa, and joining in with other European-dominated countries as part of the civilized world. North Africa was marked as being half civilized and barbarian at times, and the rest of Africa as being barbarian and savage. In addition, many of these European thinkers, for example Hegel, like we're covering today, also saw Africans as being not only primitive, but as being immoral, having no rationale, and also as having no problems with slavery and cannibalism, and this was oftentimes used for colonizing West African populations and for exploiting them.
One is that which lies south of the desert of Sahara, Africa proper, the upland almost entirely unknown to us, with narrow coast tracts along the sea. The second is that to the north of the desert, European Africa, if we may so call it, a coastland. The third is the river region of the Nile, the only valley land of Africa, and which is in connection with Asia.
North Africa is never really seen as part of Africa. It's oftentimes grouped at best with the Middle East or just having nothing to do with Africa. And this is oftentimes due to the legacy of colonialism as well as the legacy of Orientalism, or how Europe characterized the rest of the entire world. So proper Africa, as Hegel put it, or as basically how people today put it, as sub-Saharan Africa, gets grouped and characterized as being racially monolithically black. whereas North Africa serves as the black and white binary contrast to it. So instead, North Africa gets racialized as monolithically Arab, as we see in like other colonial maps of Africa. They put North Africa as Arabia, which is never properly defined across these Orientalist colonial mappings of Africa and of the East, basically. So the proper Africa, or as we call today Sub-Saharan Africa, not only does it get racialized as monolithically black, it also gets characterized as being the underdeveloped, irrational, no history, backwards contrast to the developed, civilized Europe, basically.
Africa has no history and did not contribute to anything that mankind enjoyed.
When Europeans were depicting North Africa and writing that North Africa is European Africa or has to do more with West Asia and all of that, they basically started to create these racist theories that North Africa, the Sahara, served as a racial barrier, which is not true at all. The Sahara actually did not even exist 6,000 years ago. And that's the funny part too. And there have been a lot of trade between Hausas of northern Nigeria with the Amazigh people of Northwest Africa. There have been a lot of trade even between Egypt and Sudan and etc. There have been a lot of trade with many North Africans and East Africans, North Africans and West Africans. But yet they just, in this characterization, they don't even pay attention to that. They draw all of that out. They literally draw all of that out. And it also ignores that there are great cultural affinities between numerous cultures in West Africa, with cultures in North Africa, and as well as with cultures in East Africa.
Let's listen to the Moroccan Rababa and the Ethiopian Masinko. Two instruments that they may look different, with the Rababa being round-shaped and the Masinko is diamond-shaped, but sound almost identical. And it's not just the music that is similar. Observe as both Moroccans and Ethiopian dance with fluid shoulder movements. That is one example. However, I want to show you another one. There is a famous dance in Ethiopia, and I found a similar dance to it in Morocco. Let's watch it together. I notice so many similarities between the Amazigh and the Ethiopians. From the music to the clay pots and the tagines, and how women of the two nations use tattoos as a sign of beauty. And if we dig more, we will find so many beautiful things in common, revealing the close cultural ties between the two nations.
And the funny thing is that some people even justify and try to further the separation between North Africa from the rest of Africa, which, like we just covered, is a colonial racist division, with the argument of, well, North Africans, they see themselves as being more Arab, not as African. My response to this is, why does being Arab have to be in contrast to being African? No one ever questions if the Colombian person's Hispanic identity is ever in contrast to their South American identity. But the minute it's with North Africa, all of a sudden it's, oh, well, they see themselves as Arab and that means they can't be African, which again is an Orientalist colonial conception that Africa cannot also be Arab too. that being Arab is in contrast with being African. That's a European conception, you know? But for somehow, when it comes for North Africans, the cultural linguistic identity of North Africans being an Arabic dialect, for some reason, has to automatically be unconscious. You have to pick one or the other. You have to be either Arab or you have to be African. And it's like, why can't you be both, you know? But the minute it has to do with North Africa, automatically linguistics and culture plays, for some reason, a division. And I find that to be very stupid, to be honest. Nobody bothers to even question whether a Nigerian Yoruba see themselves as being Yoruba or see themselves as being African, you know? But because we think Yoruba equals blackness, then that for some reason is in harmony with being African. And because you think that being Arab cannot at all be black, for some reason you look at that as being not in harmony with Africa, because you look at Africa as being black, only monolithically black. And you look at being Arab has to not be black. So for you, it creates this racial, not only racial, but this harmony of the two, as if like you can't be both black and white, you have to be one or the other, which I find stupid. There are black Arabs. Arab is not skin color. And in this context, you know, Arab serves as a language, as an ethnic group. Like Yoruba is a language and it's an ethnic group too. And it's crazy, not much people are actually really well aware of how much North Africa played a critical role in Pan-Africanism, specifically the politique of Pan-Africanism, a critical role in fighting against colonialism and in fighting off European colonizers from Africa and in fighting for African countries to be independent.
Algeria is my country. I do not know whether you are aware that I was the first South African to be given military training in Algeria. I went back home feeling that I was a man.
Algeria fought against the apartheid state in South Africa by funding the anti-apartheid struggle. The Algerian army even trained Mandela in guerrilla warfare. Algeria then became the first country Mandela visited when he was released from prison for fighting against the apartheid in South Africa. Algeria also gave refuge to the Black Panthers who were being hunted in the United States for fighting against white supremacy. While the American government was assassinating Black Panther members, locking them up in prison and torturing them, it was Algeria who gave the Black Panthers a home, gave them monthly provisions, gave them a place to stay, and even turn a blind eye to their political activities. It was Ahmed Ben Bella of Algeria, who was one of the 5 founding members of the Organization of African Unity, even fought to get rid of colonialism out of Africa and to not view Algeria's independence without the independence of all of Africa, and as a result fought for the freedom of all African countries. Aside from being one of the other 5 members of creating the OAU, Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt also worked alongside Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana in promoting Pan-Africanism throughout the continent and in fighting for the independence of all African countries. Gaddafi of Libya declared for Africa's reparations in front of the UN. He gave interest-free loans to several African nations, and when they could not pay the loans back, he forgave the loans and even gave it to them as a grant. Gaddafi was also working on a US of Africa plan to unify the African continent with a single African currency to free Africa so Africa could develop without modern Western imperialism. He also aimed to create a united Africa with a unifying currency, the gold dinar, and even an army to defend the continent and a single passport for Africans. He also longed to protect Africa's natural resources from Western looters. Fun fact, the first ever Pan-Africanist festival happened in Algiers, in Algeria. In 1969, Algeria hosted the first ever Pan-African festival, where people from different parts of Africa came to Algeria, came to the capital of Algiers, and celebrated being African, celebrated their different unique cultures, all in Algeria, and where being African was unified. African Americans were also invited as well, and Nina Simone, for instance, was also invited to play in Algiers, in Algeria, at the Pan-African Festival in 1969.
The dichotomy, the opposition that is created between a supposedly Arab North Africa and a supposedly black sub-Saharan Africa is a false one. The linkages between us are too great, too deep, for us to simply brush them aside. We are not defined, as far as I see it, by our respective religions, our geographies, language, all of these obstacles I mentioned earlier. What I have found out is that we are defined collectively, North Africa and the rest of the continent, by three things. We are defined by a shared history. We are defined by binding values. We are defined by a common destiny.
So next time you come ask me this dumb question, I know North Africa is everybody African, please check your inner colonialism. Please check your inner bias. Because why can't you be both? One does not negate the other. Peace.